The silence lasted exactly 17 seconds. In the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Crisis Response Center in Quantico, Virginia, 17 seconds felt like 17 hours. Then came the voice, calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who had already accepted the impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I need you to listen very carefully. Put down the detonator. Walk toward the window. Keep your hands where I can see them. Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez froze at his console. The negotiation had been declared a failure 3 minutes earlier. Protocol demanded immediate tactical intervention. SWAT teams were already in position. The building evacuation was complete. Every agency manual, every training scenario, every piece of conventional wisdom said the same thing. When communication breaks down with an armed subject threatening mass casualties, you don't keep talking. You act, but someone was still talking. The voice belonged to no one on the authorized response team. It carried no federal badge number, no agency call sign, no tactical designation. It came through a hijacked emergency frequency that shouldn't have been accessible to civilians. The woman speaking had somehow patched into the primary negotiation channel during the most critical moment of a domestic terrorism crisis that had already claimed 2 lives and threatened hundreds more. Rodriguez's fingers hovered over the emergency cutoff switch. One flip would terminate the unauthorized communication. Standard operating procedure. Clean, simple, by the book. His hand trembled slightly as the voice continued, steady and unhurried, as if she were discussing weekend plans rather than preventing a catastrophic explosion in downtown Chicago. I know you're angry. I know you feel like no one has listened to you. But this isn't the way to make them understand. Through the reinforced glass of the Situation Room, Rodriguez could see Deputy Director Sarah Chun reviewing tactical options with the SWAT commander. Her face was drawn tight with the kind of exhaustion that came from 12 hours of failed negotiations and mounting political pressure. The Secretary of Homeland Security had called twice in the last hour. The mayor of Chicago was demanding answers. Cable news networks were running continuous coverage of the standoff that had paralyzed the financial district since dawn. None of them knew about the unauthorized voice. Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt his dreams and define his career. He didn't flip the switch. Instead, he leaned closer to his headset and listened. The crisis had begun at 6:47 a.m. Central Time when Thomas Garrett walked into the Meridian Financial Tower carrying the backpack full of C4 explosive, a modified cell phone detonator, and a grievance list that read like a manifesto of economic desperation. 38 years old, recently divorced, facing foreclosure on his home after losing his job as a construction supervisor, Garrett represented the kind of domestic threat that kept federal agencies awake at night. Educated enough to build sophisticated weapons, desperate enough to use them, and angry enough to blame his personal failures on systemic injustices that couldn't be solved with a single conversation. The tower housed the regional headquarters of 3 major banks, 2 investment firms, and a federal credit union. On a typical Tuesday morning, nearly 4,000 people worked within the building's 42 floors. Garrett had chosen his target with careful deliberation. He'd studied the building's layout, identified the structural weaknesses, calculated the maximum psychological impact. He wanted the world to watch. He wanted them to understand that ordinary people could be pushed too far. The first hostage negotiator, Agent Patricia Williams, had been on the line with Garrett for 4 hours before the situation deteriorated beyond repair. Williams was good at her job. She'd talked down 17 potential suicide bombers in her 12-year career. She understood the psychology of desperate people. She knew how to find the human connection that could bridge the gap between rage and reason. He'd planned for negotiation. He'd anticipated the psychological tactics, the appeals to family, the promises of fair treatment, and media attention. He'd prepared counter-arguments to every standard approach. When Williams offered him a platform to voice his grievances publicly, he'd laughed. When she mentioned his elderly mother, he'd provided her obituary date. When she promised him legal representation and a fair trial, he'd recited case law proving that domestic terrorists received no meaningful justice. At 11:23 a.m., Williams made her final offer: safe passage out of the building in exchange for the release of all hostages and the surrender of his weapon. Garrett's response was to detonate a small charge near the lobby's main entrance. No one was killed, but 2 security guards suffered severe injuries from flying debris. The explosion also severed the building's primary communication lines, isolating Garrett from further contact with federal negotiators. That should have been the end of the talking phase. SWAT teams began their final approach. Tactical specialists prepared to breach the 34th floor where Garrett had barricaded himself with 7 hostages in a conference room overlooking the Chicago River. The plan was clean and efficient. Flashbang grenades through the windows. Simultaneous entry from multiple angles, overwhelming force to neutralize the threat before he could trigger the main explosive device. But plans in crisis situations rarely survive first contact with reality. At 11:41 a.m., 18 minutes after the lobby explosion, the unauthorized voice appeared on the emergency frequency. She didn't identify herself. She didn't request permission. She simply began talking to Thomas Garrett as if she had every right to be there. "Thomas, I want you to look out the window. Do you see the river?" The question was so simple, so unexpected, that it cut through the tactical chatter like a blade. In the Situation Room, conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the speakers. Someone reached for the frequency scanner, trying to trace the signal's origin. "I see it," came Garrett's reply, and his voice carried a different quality than it had during the official negotiations. Less defensive, more curious. "What's your point?" "No point. I just wanted to make sure you could still see something beautiful. Sometimes when everything feels broken, we forget that beautiful things still exist." Rodriguez felt his chest tighten. This wasn't the negotiation technique they taught at the academy. This wasn't psychology or strategy or tactical communication. This was something else entirely, something that felt more like a conversation between 2 people who understood each other in ways that official protocols couldn't capture. Deputy Director Chen had noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. She approached Rodriguez's station, her eyes fixed on the audio display showing active transmission from an unknown source. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Rodriguez shook his head. "We don't know. Signals coming through on emergency backup. But it's not from any of our people." Chun reached for the cutoff switch, but Rodriguez caught her wrist. "Ma'am, she's got him talking." They both listened as the unauthorized negotiator continued, her voice carrying a quality that made the hair on the back of Rodriguez's neck stand up. She wasn't following any playbook. She wasn't trying to manipulate or cajole or persuade. She was simply present with Garrett in a way that felt completely genuine. "You know what I see when I look at that river?" she continued. "I see water that's been flowing for thousands of years. Before this city existed, before any of us were born, before any of the problems that brought you here today. That water doesn't care about bank policies or foreclosure notices or unemployment statistics. It just keeps moving. Easy philosophy when you're not the one losing everything." Garrett replied, but there was less edge in his voice than before. "You're right. I don't know your specific pain. But I know what it feels like to watch everything you've built disappear. I know what it feels like to be invisible to the people who make decisions about your life. I know what it feels like to think that breaking something is the only way to make them pay attention." In the Situation Room, Chun looked at Rodriguez with raised eyebrows. This wasn't standard crisis negotiation. This was something far more personal and far more dangerous. Unauthorized personnel establishing emotional connections with armed subjects. Violated every protocol in the Federal Response Manual, but it was working. They don't care, Garrett said, and for the first time since the crisis began, his voice carried vulnerability instead of rage. They took my house, they took my job, they took my dignity. They left me with nothing but debt and paperwork and lawyers who charge more per hour than I used to make in a week. They didn't take everything, the woman replied. They couldn't take your ability to make a choice right now. They couldn't take your ability to walk away from this. They couldn't take the fact that you're still a human being with value that has nothing to do with your credit score or your employment status. Rodriguez realized he was holding his breath. Around the Situation Room, federal agents and tactical specialists had gone completely silent, all of them listening to a conversation that shouldn't have been happening between two people who shouldn't have been able to reach each other. The woman's voice had a quality that was difficult to define. It wasn't the practiced empathy of a trained negotiator. It wasn't the clinical detachment of a psychologist. It wasn't the authoritative command of a law enforcement officer. It was something more fundamental, the sound of one human being recognizing another human being's pain without judgment or agenda. You don't understand, Garrett said. I've lost everything. There's nothing left. There's this moment, she replied. There's right now. There's the choice you make in the next 60 seconds. That choice belongs to you completely. No bank can foreclose on it. No employer can fire you from it. No lawyer can charge you for. It's yours. Through the tactical frequency, Rodriguez could hear SWAT team leaders requesting permission to proceed. The building's structural engineers were expressing concern about the integrity of the 34th floor if the main explosive device detonated. Time was running out in ways that had nothing to do with negotiation and everything to do with physics and public safety. But Deputy Director Chen held up her hand, signaling the teams to wait. She was listening too. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I planned this for 6 months, Garrett said. I studied every angle. I knew exactly how it would end. Plans change, the woman replied. That's what makes us human instead of machines. We can choose differently than we planned. We can surprise ourselves. And then what? I surrender and spend the rest of my life in federal prison? I become another statistic, another cautionary tale about domestic terrorism? At least this way, people will remember why I did it. They'll remember the explosion. They won't remember you. They won't remember your reasons or your pain, or the fact that you were a person who mattered before you became a headline. Explosions are loud, but they don't actually say anything. If you want people to understand your story, you have to be alive to tell it. Rodriguez glanced at the digital clock on his console. The standoff had been active for over 5 hours. Tactical teams were reporting fatigue. Media attention was intensifying. Political pressure was mounting. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that someone would make a decision that couldn't be undone. But the voice on the emergency frequency seemed immune to time pressure. She spoke as if she had all day, as if there were no cameras, or politicians or tactical teams. As if there were only two people having a conversation about choices and consequences, and the possibility of hope in impossible circumstances. I don't even know who you are, Garrett said. Does it matter? I guess not. I expected this conversation to go differently. How did you expect it to go? I expected them to lie to me, to make promises they couldn't keep, to treat me like a problem that needed to be solved instead of a person who needed to be heard. And how do you feel like you're being treated right now? There was a long pause. In the Situation Room, Rodriguez could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. When Garrett finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Like maybe somebody actually understands. The woman's response came without hesitation. carrying a certainty that cut through the technical static and emotional noise of the crisis. Then you know you have a choice to make. And you know that whatever you choose, at least one person in the world will understand why you chose it. Rodriguez looked around the situation room and realized that something fundamental had shifted. The atmosphere had changed from tactical urgency to something that felt more like witnessing a private conversation between two people who had found each other across an impossible divide. Every federal agent, every tactical specialist, every administrator and analyst was listening to a negotiation that existed outside the boundaries of their training and experience. And in that moment, Rodriguez understood that they were about to witness something that would redefine everything they thought they knew about crisis resolution, human connection, and the power of one person's voice to reach another person's humanity when all official channels had failed. The question was whether that understanding would come through peaceful surrender or catastrophic explosion. The answer lay in the next words spoken by a man with his finger on a detonator and a woman whose identity remained completely unknown to the federal agents whose protocols she had abandoned in favor of something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Simple human truth. 12 hours earlier, the Meridian Financial Tower buzzed with the routine energy of a normal Tuesday morning. Coffee shops on the ground floor served their usual stream of bleary-eyed commuters. Security guards checked identification badges with practiced efficiency. Elevator banks hummed with the familiar choreography of corporate life ascending to another day of meetings, deadlines, and quarterly projections. Dr. Elena Martinez sat in her modest office on the 18th floor, reviewing psychological profiles that bore no resemblance to the crisis that would soon engulf the building. As the tower's employee assistance counselor, her typical Tuesday involved helping middle managers cope with workplace stress, mediating conflicts between departments, and occasionally talking someone through a panic attack brought on by performance. Reviews or reorganization announcements. Her office walls displayed the standard credentials of her profession: a doctorate in clinical psychology from Northwestern University, certificates from various crisis intervention training programs, professional memberships in associations that specialized in workplace mental health. What the wall didn't show was her unconventional background: 5 years as a volunteer crisis counselor for the Chicago Police Department, 2 years working with veterans suffering from PTSD, and countless nights spent on suicide prevention hotlines, talking strangers through their darkest moments with nothing but her voice and her ability to find connection across the void of human desperation. Elena preferred the invisible work, the conversations that happened in conference rooms rather than courtrooms, the problems solved with listening rather than litigation. Corporate executives rarely suspected that the soft-spoken woman who facilitated their conflict resolution workshops had spent years talking people back from ledges, both literal and metaphorical. Her colleagues knew her as someone who could calm heated discussions and find common ground between opposing viewpoints, but they had no idea that she had once talked a former Marine out of driving his car into the Chicago River at 3 o'clock on a February morning. That Tuesday morning, Elena's appointment schedule included a consultation with Rebecca Torres from Human Resources about developing a stress management program for the accounting department. The meeting was routine corporate wellness initiatives designed to reduce employee turnover and improve productivity metrics. Elena had facilitated dozens of similar programs, helping organizations balance the competing demands of efficiency and humanity in an increasingly demanding economic environment. Rebecca arrived precisely on time, carrying a folder full of employee satisfaction surveys and absenteeism statistics. She was the kind of HR professional who approached workplace problems with systematic methodology, breaking down human complexities into manageable data points that could be addressed through policy adjustments and training modules. We're seeing increased stress indicators across multiple departments, Rebecca explained. spreading charts across Elena's desk, particularly in areas where we've had to implement staffing reductions. People are working longer hours, taking fewer vacation days, and our exit interviews suggest that burnout is becoming a significant retention issue. Elena studied the data while mentally translating the corporate language into human terms. Behind every statistic was a person struggling to balance mortgage payments with job security, family obligations with professional advancement, personal health with organizational demands. The numbers told a story of systematic pressure that pushed individuals toward breaking points they rarely recognized until they had already passed them. "Have you noticed any particular triggers?" Elena asked. "Specific events or policy changes that seem to correlate with increased stress reports?" Rebecca nodded grimly. "The merger announcement last month created significant uncertainty. We've also had to adjust benefits packages to remain competitive, which means higher deductibles and reduced coverage for some employees. And there's been talk about relocating some operations to our Dallas facility, which has people worried about job security." Elena made notes while recognizing patterns she had seen throughout her career. Economic pressure created a cascade of stress that affected individuals, families, and entire communities. People who had built their identities around stable employment found themselves questioning their value when organizational priorities shifted. The psychological impact of financial insecurity extended far beyond bank account balances, affecting self-worth, relationship stability, and mental health in ways that corporate policies rarely acknowledged. "I'd recommend starting with voluntary discussion groups," Elena suggested. "Create space for people to voice their concerns without feeling like they're being evaluated or judged. Sometimes the most powerful intervention is simply letting people know they're not alone in their stress." As Rebecca gathered her materials, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the Chicago Crisis Intervention Center. She had been volunteering there for 3 years, working evening shifts on the suicide prevention hotline. The message was routine, confirming her scheduled shift for that evening and reminding her about updated protocols for handling calls involving domestic violence situations. Elena had discovered her talent for crisis intervention almost by accident. During graduate school, she had volunteered for a campus mental health program that provided late-night support for students experiencing psychological emergencies. Her first call involved a sophomore engineering student who had barricaded himself in his dormitory room after receiving news that his father had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Official counselors were not immediately available, and Elena had been asked to maintain contact until professional help arrived. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. The student talked about feeling overwhelmed by academic pressure while dealing with family crisis, about guilt over not being home to support his mother, about fear that he was wasting time on a degree that might not matter if his family fell apart. Elena listened without offering solutions or judgment, simply creating space for him to voice fears that he had been carrying alone for weeks. When the professional counselor finally arrived, the student had already decided to take a leave of absence to spend time with his family. He thanked Elena for helping him realize that his education would still be available when he was ready to return, but his father might not be. The counselor later commented that Elena had demonstrated remarkable intuition for crisis communication, suggesting that she consider specialized training in the field. Elena's approach to crisis intervention developed organically rather than through formal methodology. She discovered that her most effective tool was genuine curiosity about the person behind the crisis. Instead of focusing on symptoms or solutions, she concentrated on understanding the individual's unique perspective on their situation. She asked questions that encouraged people to explore their own feelings rather than providing answers that might not fit their specific circumstances. Her colleagues at the Crisis Center often marveled at her success rate with difficult cases. She seemed particularly effective with individuals who had become resistant to traditional therapeutic approaches, people who had been through multiple treatment programs, who had developed defenses against standard psychological techniques, who had reached the point where they no longer trusted professional helpers to understand their situation. Elena's secret was that she didn't approach crisis calls as a professional trying to fix a problem. She approached them as one human being connecting with another human being who was experiencing pain. She didn't pretend to have answers that she didn't possess, and she didn't minimize suffering that she hadn't experienced personally. Instead, she created space for authentic conversation about difficult realities, allowing people to feel heard without feeling judged. Tuesday afternoon brought a series of routine counseling sessions that would seem trivial in retrospect but represented the quiet foundation of Elena's work. A marketing coordinator dealing with anxiety about an upcoming presentation. A security supervisor struggling with work-life balance after his wife gave birth to twins. An accounting clerk who had been having panic attacks since her department was reorganized. Each conversation followed Elena's standard approach: careful listening, thoughtful questions, and collaborative exploration of options that respected the individual's autonomy and dignity. She didn't provide quick fixes or miracle solutions. She helped people clarify their own thinking and develop strategies that aligned with their values and circumstances. At 4:30 p.m., Elena received an unusual request. Building security had asked her to consult on a situation involving an individual who had been observed in the lobby for several hours, apparently waiting for someone who never arrived. The person appeared agitated and had been asking security guards questions about building access policies and employee schedules. Elena made her way to the main lobby, where she observed a middle-aged man sitting near the information desk with a coffee cup and a manila folder. He was dressed neatly but showed signs of stress, fidgeting hands, frequent glances toward the elevator banks, and a general air of barely contained frustration. His body language suggested someone wrestling with a difficult decision, rather than someone planning immediate violence. Security Chief David Park briefed Elena quietly near the reception area. "He's been here since noon. Says he's waiting to speak with someone in the loan modification department at First National. We told him their offices are on the 22nd floor and he needs an appointment, but he keeps saying it's urgent and he just needs 5 minutes. He's not threatening anyone, but he seems pretty wound up." Elena studied the man from a distance, noting details that security might have missed. His clothes were clean but showed signs of wear, a shirt that had been pressed but was beginning to fray at the collar, shoes that were polished but needed resoling. His folder was thick with papers, and she could see the edges of what appeared to be legal documents and bank statements. Everything about his appearance suggested someone fighting to maintain dignity while facing a financial crisis. "Has he given you his name?" Elena asked. "Thomas something. Said he used to work construction but got laid off last year. He's not being aggressive, just persistent. Keeps saying this is his last chance to save his house." Elena approached Thomas, carefully, maintaining open body language and speaking in a calm tone. "Excuse me, I'm Elena Martinez from Employee Services. I understand you're trying to reach someone about a loan modification." Thomas looked up with eyes that showed the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting bureaucracy for months. "They keep transferring me between departments. I've sent letters, made phone calls, filled out applications. Every time I think I'm making progress, someone tells me I need to talk to someone else. I figured if I came here in person, maybe someone would actually listen." Elena sat down across from him, noting the careful organization of his documents and the desperate hope in his voice. "It sounds like you've been working really hard to find a solution. That must be incredibly frustrating." "I built houses for 23 years, Thomas said, his voice gaining strength as someone finally showed interest in his story. "Good houses, solid construction. Never missed a mortgage payment until the economy tanked and contractors stopped. Building. I've been looking for work, taking temporary jobs, doing everything right. But the bank doesn't care about any of that. They just want their money on schedule. Elena listened as Thomas described a cascade of circumstances that had transformed him from a stable homeowner into someone facing foreclosure. Medical bills from his ex-wife's cancer treatment. Unemployment benefits that had expired. A job market that favored younger workers with more flexible schedules. Each setback had been manageable individually, but their cumulative impact had created a financial crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. "I'm not asking for charity," Thomas explained. "I just need them to work with me on a payment plan that reflects my current situation instead of the income I had 5 years ago. I've got documentation showing that I'm good for the money if they'll just give me time to get back on my feet." Elena recognized the profile of someone who had exhausted official channels and was approaching desperation. Thomas wasn't seeking handouts or making unreasonable demands. He was asking for the kind of flexibility that financial institutions occasionally provided, but rarely advertised. His presence in the lobby represented a last-ditch effort to find human connection within a system that had treated him as a series of numbers rather than a person with a legitimate problem. "Would it help if I made some calls to see who might be available to meet with you today?" Elena offered. "Sometimes these things work better when there's a personal introduction." Thomas's face showed the first glimpse of hope she had seen since approaching him. "You'd do that? Even though I'm not your client or anything?" "Everyone deserves to be heard," Elena replied simply. "Let me see what I can arrange." Elena spent the next hour making calls to various departments within the building, eventually reaching a loan officer who agreed to meet with Thomas for 15 minutes. The conversation that followed would later seem insignificant compared to the crisis that would engulf the building, but it represented the kind of small intervention that Elena specialized in: creating human connection within impersonal systems, helping desperate people find pathways toward hope. Thomas left the building that evening with a modification application that had been expedited for review and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. Elena never saw him again, and security reported no unusual incidents for the remainder of the day. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she filed away the encounter as a reminder of how quickly ordinary people could be pushed toward extraordinary desperation when systems failed to account for human complexity. As evening approached, Elena prepared to leave for her volunteer shift at the crisis center. She had no way of knowing that within 12 hours, her two worlds would collide in ways that would test every skill she had developed over years of talking people through impossible situations. She gathered her personal belongings, secured her office, and walked past the security desk where Thomas had spent his afternoon, unaware that she had just witnessed the calm before a storm that would transform her from an invisible counselor into the unauthorized voice that would save hundreds of lives. The first sign of trouble wasn't an explosion or a scream. It was the elevator music stopping. Elena Martinez had arrived at her office early that Tuesday morning, settling into her routine of reviewing appointment schedules and preparing materials for the day's counseling sessions. The ambient sounds of corporate life provided a familiar soundtrack: elevator chimes, muffled conversations from adjacent offices, the distant hum of air conditioning systems maintaining climate control across 42 floors of organized productivity. When the music cut out at 6:47 a.m., Elena barely noticed. Technical glitches were common in older buildings, and the Meridian Financial Tower's elevator system had been showing its age for months. Maintenance requests about irregular timing and occasional mechanical noises had become routine. The silence actually felt peaceful, eliminating one source of background distraction from her morning preparations. The second anomaly occurred 3 minutes later when her computer screen flickered and displayed a brief system error message before returning to normal operation. Elena attributed it to the building's aging infrastructure and continued, reviewing psychological profiles for her scheduled appointments. Her focus remained on the mundane challenges of workplace counseling, helping employees navigate personality conflicts, performance anxiety, and the various stresses that accompanied corporate restructuring. At 6:52 a.m., Security Chief David Park's voice crackled through the building's public address system with an announcement that initially sounded routine. Ladies and gentlemen, we're conducting a security drill on floors 30 through 42. Please remain in your current locations until further notice. This is a precautionary measure, and there is no immediate danger. Elena glanced at her appointment calendar, wondering if the drill would affect her 9 a.m. meeting with a department supervisor who had been struggling with team management issues. Security drills typically lasted 20 to 30 minutes, involving staged scenarios designed to test evacuation procedures and emergency response protocols. They were inconvenient but necessary components of modern building management, particularly in structures that housed financial institutions and attracted large daily populations. The announcement repeated twice more over the next 10 minutes, each iteration carrying a slightly more urgent tone that suggested the drill was expanding beyond its original scope. Elena began to notice subtle changes in the building's atmosphere. Conversations in the hallway had become quieter and more hurried. Phone calls were being made with increased frequency. The usual flow of people moving between floors had virtually stopped. At 7:08 a.m., Elena's phone rang with a call from Rebecca Torres in Human Resources. Rebecca's voice carried an edge of controlled panic that immediately captured Elena's attention. "Elena, I need you to cancel your morning appointments. We've got a situation developing, and I might need your crisis intervention expertise." "What kind of situation?" Elena asked, already beginning to shift her mental framework from routine counseling to emergency response. "Someone's in the building who shouldn't be here. Security is trying to contain the situation, but there might be weapons involved. I can't give you details over the phone, but stay in your office and be prepared to assist with employee support if this escalates." Rebecca disconnected before Elena could ask follow-up questions, leaving her with fragments of information that painted an incomplete picture of potential danger. Elena's training in crisis intervention had taught her to remain calm while gathering additional data, but her experience with emergency situations had also taught her to trust her instincts when something felt fundamentally wrong. She opened her computer's emergency protocols folder and reviewed procedures for workplace violence incidents. The corporate guidelines emphasized personal safety above all other considerations. Employees were instructed to evacuate if possible, hide if evacuation wasn't feasible, and contact law enforcement if neither option was available. The protocols made no mention of employees with crisis intervention training providing support during active emergencies. At 7:15 a.m., the building's fire alarm system activated with a pattern Elena had never heard before. Instead of the steady tone that indicated evacuation, the alarm produced intermittent bursts that suggested a different type of emergency. The sound was jarring and disorienting, designed to capture attention without triggering panic-driven evacuation that might complicate law enforcement response. Elena's office window provided a view of the Chicago River and the downtown financial district beyond. She could see police vehicles beginning to gather in the streets below, their red and blue lights creating a visual confirmation that whatever was happening inside the building had attracted official attention. The response appeared coordinated and professional, but the sheer number of vehicles suggested a situation that extended beyond routine security concerns. Her cell phone buzzed with a text message from the Chicago Crisis Intervention Center where she volunteered evening shifts. The message was brief but alarming. Multiple agencies responding to incident at Meridian Tower. All available crisis counselors on standby. Will contact you if civilian support is needed. Elena realized that her two professional worlds, corporate Employee assistance and emergency crisis intervention were converging in ways she had never anticipated. She was simultaneously inside the emergency as a potential victim and outside it as a trained responder. The psychological dissonance created a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing the situation from multiple perspectives. Simultaneously. At 7:23 a.m., the building's public address system crackled again with Security Chief Park's voice. But this time the carefully maintained calm had been replaced by barely controlled urgency. This is not a drill. All personnel on floors 1 through 29 should evacuate immediately using stairwells Alpha and Bravo. Do not use elevators. Personnel on floors 30 through 42 should shelter in place until further notice. Repeat, this is not a drill. Elena's office was on the 18th floor, placing her in the evacuation zone. She gathered her emergency kit, a small bag containing water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a battery-powered radio that she maintained as part of her crisis intervention preparedness. Her training had emphasized the importance of being self-sufficient during emergencies, both for personal safety and to avoid becoming an additional burden on emergency responders. The hallway outside her office had transformed into a controlled chaos of evacuating employees. People moved with purpose but without panic, following evacuation routes they had practiced during monthly drills. Elena joined the stream of individuals heading toward the stairwell, noting the professional calm that characterized the exodus. Corporate training and emergency preparedness had created a culture where people knew how to respond to crisis situations without losing composure. As she descended the stairs, Elena overheard fragments of conversation that provided additional context for the developing situation. Someone mentioned a man with a backpack who had been seen arguing with security guards. Another person described hearing what sounded like construction equipment operating on an upper floor. A third individual reported seeing federal law enforcement vehicles in the parking structure. Elena's crisis intervention training had taught her to listen for patterns in chaotic information. The fragments she gathered suggested an individual who had gained unauthorized access to the building, possibly with weapons or explosive devices, and had barricaded himself on one of the upper floors. The federal response indicated that the threat was being treated as potential domestic terrorism, rather than workplace violence or personal grievance. When Elena reached the building's lobby, she encountered a scene that confirmed her assessment. Federal agents wearing FBI windbreakers were establishing a command post near the main entrance. Tactical equipment was being unloaded from unmarked vehicles. Communication specialists were setting up antenna arrays and satellite links. The response was too sophisticated and too rapid to represent anything other than a pre-planned protocol for domestic terrorism incidents. Evacuated employees were being directed to a staging area in the adjacent parking structure, where representatives from various agencies were conducting brief interviews about what they had observed before the evacuation began. Elena waited her turn, using the time to observe the professional coordination between federal agents, local police, and building security personnel. When her turn came, Elena spoke with a young FBI agent who recorded basic information about her location during the incident and whether she had observed any unusual activities. She mentioned her background in crisis intervention, thinking it might be relevant to the developing situation, but the agent simply noted the information without comment and moved on to the next evacuee. At 8:17 a.m., while Elena stood in the parking structure with hundreds of other displaced employees, the first explosion occurred. The blast wasn't large enough to cause structural damage, but it was loud enough to be heard clearly through the building's concrete and steel construction. The sound produced an immediate silence among the evacuated employees, followed by a collective intake of breath as everyone processed the reality that they had been removed from immediate danger just in time. Elena watched federal agents respond to the explosion with practiced efficiency. Radio communications increased in frequency and urgency. Additional tactical teams were summoned. Helicopter surveillance appeared overhead. The incident had escalated beyond hostage negotiation into an active domestic terrorism response. A second explosion followed 12 minutes later, this one accompanied by the sound of breaking glass and falling debris. Elena could see smoke beginning to drift from windows on the 34th floor, confirming the general location of the threat. The building's fire suppression systems activated automatically, creating additional visual drama as water began cascading from damaged windows. Despite her distance from the immediate danger, Elena felt the familiar psychological shift that accompanied crisis situations. Her nervous system activated the heightened awareness and emotional regulation that she had developed through years of emergency response work. She found herself analyzing the tactical response, evaluating communication patterns, and considering intervention strategies even though she had no official role in the developing situation. At 8:45 a.m., Elena's emergency radio picked up traffic from law enforcement, frequencies that provided more detailed information about what was happening inside the building. The subject was identified as Thomas Garrett, a 38-year-old unemployed construction worker. He had taken hostages on the 34th floor and was threatening to detonate a larger, explosive device if his demands weren't met. Elena felt a chill of recognition as she processed the name and description. Thomas Garrett was the man she had helped the previous afternoon, the individual who had spent hours in the lobby trying to reach someone about his loan modification. The person she had connected with a bank representative in what seemed like a successful intervention. Her mind raced through the implications of this connection. Thomas hadn't been a random terrorist planning an attack on financial institutions. He had been a desperate man seeking legitimate help through appropriate channels. Something had happened between his appointment yesterday and this morning that had transformed him from someone seeking assistance into someone threatening mass casualties. Elena's crisis intervention training had taught her that the gap between seeking help and committing violence was often smaller than people realized. When individuals exhausted official channels and found themselves facing impossible circumstances, they sometimes concluded that dramatic action was their only remaining option for making their situation visible to people with the power to help them. She realized that she possessed unique insight into Thomas Garrett's psychological state and motivation. She had witnessed his transition from hopeful petitioner to desperate actor. She understood the specific circumstances that had driven him to this extreme response. Most importantly, she had successfully established rapport with him during their previous interaction, creating a foundation for communication that might prove crucial in resolving the current crisis. Elena approached the FBI command post with careful determination, knowing that her unsolicited input would likely be dismissed, but recognizing that she might possess information that could save lives. She waited for an appropriate moment, then addressed the agent coordinating civilian interviews. "I need to speak with whoever's handling the negotiation with Thomas Garrett. I know him personally, and I think I can help." The agent looked at her with skeptical attention. "Ma'am, this is an active federal operation. Civilians aren't permitted to participate in tactical response." "I'm not asking to participate," Elena replied calmly. "I'm telling you that I spent an hour with this man yesterday, helping him with the same issues that apparently drove him to this action today. I understand his psychological profile and his specific grievances. That information might be useful to your negotiation team." The agent studied Elena's identification badge and made notes about her statement, but his expression suggested that her information would be filed rather than acted upon. Federal protocols didn't accommodate input from civilians, regardless of their professional qualifications or relevant experience. Elena stepped back from the command post, understanding that official channels wouldn't provide her with access to the negotiation process. But her crisis intervention instincts were fully activated now. And she couldn't simply stand in a parking structure while a man she had tried to help 12 hours earlier spiraled toward a catastrophic conclusion. She began developing an alternative plan that would allow her to contribute to the resolution without waiting for official permission that would never come. Elena Martinez stood at the edge of the evacuated zone, watching federal agents coordinate their response with the methodical precision of a machine designed for exactly this type of crisis. Command vehicles formed geometric patterns in the parking structure. Communication arrays sprouted from rooftops like technological flowers reaching toward satellites. Tactical teams moved with choreographed efficiency between staging areas and equipment caches, but machines, Elena knew from her years of crisis intervention work, couldn't reach the human core of desperation that drove people like Thomas Garrett to explosive conclusions. She walked away from the official command post with deliberate casualness, carrying her emergency radio and appearing to be just another displaced employee seeking a quieter location to wait out the crisis. Her destination was a maintenance shed near the building's service entrance, where she had noticed communication cables running underground toward the tower's infrastructure systems. Elena's volunteer work with the Chicago Police Department had included training on emergency communication protocols. She understood how crisis negotiation teams established contact with subjects, the technical requirements for maintaining clear audio connections, and the backup systems that activated when primary channels failed. More importantly, she knew that most emergency communication networks included civilian access points that were rarely secured during the initial stages of crisis response. The maintenance shed was unlocked, protected only by a basic combination lock whose numbers Elena deduced by examining wear patterns on the dial mechanism. Inside, she found the junction box she had hoped to locate, a gray metal cabinet containing backup communication lines that served the building's security systems and emergency protocols. Elena's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years working with technical equipment under pressure. During her police department training, she had learned to operate radio systems, patch into communication networks, and establish emergency frequencies when standard channels became compromised. The skills were intended to help crisis counselors maintain contact with subjects when official negotiators became unavailable, but they also provided access to communication infrastructure that could be used in ways the training manual had never contemplated. She connected her portable radio to the building's emergency communication network through a series of cable splices and frequency adjustments that would have impressed the FBI's technical specialists if they had been aware of her activities. The connection gave her access to multiple radio channels, including the primary frequency being used for tactical coordination and the backup channel reserved for direct contact with Thomas Garrett. Elena spent 20 minutes listening to official communications, gaining insight into the federal response strategy and the specific challenges facing the negotiation team. Agent Patricia Williams was struggling to establish meaningful dialogue with Thomas, who seemed prepared for standard psychological approaches and was responding to official outreach with increasing hostility and paranoid rhetoric. He's not buying any of the standard rapport-building techniques, Williams reported to her supervisor during a brief tactical update. Every time I try to establish common ground or show empathy for his situation, he accuses me of reading from a script and trying to manipulate him. He seems to have studied negotiation psychology and developed counter-strategies for most of our standard approaches. Elena understood the problem immediately. Thomas wasn't responding to professional negotiation because he had lost faith in professional systems. His experience with bank representatives, unemployment counselors, legal aid services, and bureaucratic processes had taught him to distrust anyone who approached him with institutional authority and practiced empathy. He could recognize the difference between genuine human connection and strategic psychological manipulation. Subject is demanding media attention for his grievances, Williams continued. He wants live television coverage of his statement about economic injustice and systematic failure of safety net programs. He's threatening to detonate his main device if we don't provide him with a platform to address the public within the next 2 hours. Elena knew that federal protocols prohibited negotiating with terrorists about media access. The FBI couldn't establish precedents that encouraged future subjects to seek publicity through violence. But she also understood that Thomas's demand represented his fundamental need to be heard by people who had the power to address his concerns. A need that had driven him to this desperate action when legitimate channels failed to provide him with a meaningful response. Her portable radio crackled with an incoming transmission on the backup frequency. Thomas's voice came through clearly, addressing Agent Williams with controlled anger that barely concealed deeper desperation. I know you're stalling while your tactical teams get into position. I know you're not authorized to give me what I'm asking for. I know this conversation is designed to buy time until you can breach this room and neutralize me. But you don't. Understand that I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of disappearing without anyone understanding why this happened. Elena made a decision that violated every protocol in her crisis intervention training. She switched her radio to transmit mode and keyed the microphone, hijacking the backup communication channel during a pause in the official negotiation. Thomas, this is Elena Martinez. We met yesterday afternoon in the lobby. I helped you set up that appointment with the loan officer. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. Elena could hear her own heartbeat through the radio static while federal agents presumably scrambled to identify the source of the unauthorized transmission. When Thomas finally responded, his voice carried a different quality than it had during his exchanges with Agent Williams' surprise, mixed with something that might have been relief. Elena, how are you? Why are you on this frequency? Because I heard what happened and I couldn't stand the thought that you might think no one understands why you're doing this. Elena replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I remember our conversation yesterday. I remember how frustrated you were with the system, and I remember how much you wanted someone to just listen to your situation without judging you or trying to fit you into a category. In the federal command post, Elena knew that technicians were frantically trying to trace her signal while supervisors debated whether to cut the unauthorized communication. Agent Williams would be receiving instructions about how to regain control of the negotiation. Tactical commanders would be adjusting their plans to account for civilian interference in their operation. But Elena also knew that Thomas was listening to her with the kind of attention that no federal agent could command, because she represented the one person in this crisis who had treated him as a human being rather than a problem to be solved. They told me the loan modification was approved, Thomas said, and Elena could hear tears in his voice despite his efforts to maintain control. I went home thinking everything was going to be okay. Then this morning I got a call saying there had been an error in the paperwork. The modification was denied. They said I could reapply, but it would take another 6 months to process, and my foreclosure sale is scheduled for next week. Elena felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Thomas hadn't planned this attack for months. He had been pushed over the edge by a bureaucratic failure that had occurred after she helped him the previous day. The hope she had helped him find had been destroyed by systematic incompetence, transforming him from someone working within the system into someone willing to destroy it. That must have felt like the final betrayal, Elena said, allowing genuine empathy to color her voice. You did everything right, followed all the proper procedures, got your hopes up that maybe the system was going to work for you this time. And then they pulled it away at the last second. Exactly, Thomas replied, his voice gaining strength from being understood rather than analyzed. I've been playing by their rules for 2 years, filling out forms, making appointments, providing documentation, jumping through every hoop they put in front of me. And what I realized this morning is that they never intended to help me. They just wanted to keep me busy so I wouldn't cause trouble while they processed my foreclosure. Elena understood that she was walking a psychological tightrope. She needed to validate Thomas's feelings without endorsing his actions, acknowledge the legitimacy of his grievances without accepting his solution, and maintain his trust without encouraging his violence. Her years of crisis intervention had prepared her for exactly this type of communication challenge, but never under circumstances where her own life and the lives of hundreds of others depended on her ability to find the right words. The system failed you, Elena agreed. There's no question about that. But I need you to think about whether this action is actually going to fix the problem, or just create more victims of the same system that hurt you. Elena could hear movement in the background of Thomas's transmission, the sound of hostages shifting position, possibly whispering among themselves. She realized that he had been holding 7 people captive for over 3 hours, while engaged in increasingly hostile exchanges with federal negotiators. The psychological pressure on both Thomas and his hostages was approaching breaking points. That could trigger reflexive violence regardless of anyone's intentions. The people in that room with you, Elena continued, they're not the ones who denied your loan modification. They're not the ones who created the policies that put you in this situation. They're just people trying to get through their workday so they can go home to their families. I know that, Thomas replied, and Elena heard the first crack in his resolve. I never wanted to hurt innocent people. But no one pays attention to individual suffering anymore. The only way to make them listen is to create a crisis that they can't ignore. Elena recognized the opening she needed. Thomas's statement revealed that he understood the moral complexity of his situation and retained empathy for his hostages despite his desperate circumstances. He wasn't a sociopathic terrorist seeking to maximize casualties. He was a broken man who had concluded that dramatic action was his only remaining option for making his voice heard by people with the power to help him. What if I could guarantee that your story gets told without anyone else getting hurt? Elena asked. What if I could promise you that people will understand why you felt driven to this action, and that your situation will become an example that helps other people avoid the same trap? How could you possibly guarantee that? Thomas replied, skepticism returning to his voice. You're not a reporter. You're not a government official. You're just a counselor who happened to be nice to me for one afternoon. Elena realized that she was approaching the most critical moment of the negotiation. She needed to offer Thomas something that federal agents couldn't provide, a genuine promise of human connection and understanding that transcended institutional protocols and bureaucratic limitations. Because I'll make it my personal mission, Elena said simply. I'll write about your situation. I'll contact journalists who cover economic justice issues. I'll speak at conferences about how systems can push people toward desperate actions. I'll make sure that your story becomes part of a larger conversation about how we treat people who are struggling to survive in an economy that doesn't have room for everyone. The silence that followed was longer this time, filled with the weight of a decision that would determine whether the crisis ended in tragedy or hope. Elena could hear her own breathing through the radio static while Thomas processed her offer and compared it to the alternatives he faced. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality, the sound of someone who had found a bridge between desperation and possibility. You would really do that? Even after what I've done here today? Especially because of what you've done here today, Elena replied. Because it proves that we need to change how we respond to people who are crying out for help before they reach the point where violence seems like their only option. Elena knew that federal agents were listening to every word of her unauthorized negotiation, probably debating whether to cut her communication or allow her to continue. She also knew that she was making promises she had no authority to make, committing herself to actions that extended far beyond her professional responsibilities. But she also knew that Thomas Garrett was listening to her with the kind of hope that could save lives. And that was more important than protocols or procedures or the career consequences she would face for hijacking a federal crisis response. The next voice on the radio would determine whether her invisible intervention had created a pathway toward peaceful resolution or had simply added another complication to an already impossible situation. Thomas Garrett's breathing came through the radio in shallow, irregular patterns that Elena recognized from countless crisis calls. She had heard that same rhythm from people standing on bridge railings, sitting in cars with engines running in closed garages, holding bottles of pills in darkened bedrooms. It was the sound of someone balanced on the knife edge between choosing life and choosing destruction, where the next word spoken could tip the balance in either direction. "Elena," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand something. I've got enough explosive here to bring down half this floor. The timer is set to a dead man switch. If my heart stops beating, if I get shot, if I lose consciousness, everyone in this room dies with me." Elena felt her throat constrict, but she kept her voice steady. She had trained for these moments when crisis intervention crossed the line from counseling into life or death negotiation. "I hear you, Thomas. You're telling me that any sudden action makes this situation worse for everyone. The federal agents don't seem to understand that," Thomas continued. And Elena could hear movement in the background, the careful, muffled sounds of hostages who were trying to remain invisible while positioned too close to a conversation that would determine their survival. "They keep talking about tactical solutions and containment protocols. They're planning to breach this room whether I cooperate or not." Elena's portable radio crackled with interference as federal communications overlapped her hijacked frequency. She caught fragments of tactical planning references to flashbang grenades, entry points, and acceptable casualty ratios. The FBI's hostage rescue team was preparing for scenarios that assumed negotiation would fail and force would be necessary to prevent greater loss of life. "Thomas, I want you to help me understand what you need right now," Elena said, shifting her approach toward collaborative problem-solving rather than persuasion. "Not what you wanted when this started, but what you need at this moment to feel like there's a path forward that doesn't end in tragedy." The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. Elena could hear him shifting position, possibly looking around the conference room where he had barricaded himself with 7 bank employees who had been attending a routine meeting about quarterly loan portfolios when their ordinary Tuesday morning had exploded into a domestic terrorism crisis. "I need someone to acknowledge that this isn't random violence," Thomas said finally. "I need people to understand that I'm not a monster who woke up one morning and decided to hurt innocent people. I'm someone who tried every legitimate option and discovered that the system is designed to grind people like me into dust while pretending to offer help." Elena recognized the deeper psychological need beneath Thomas's demand for media attention. He wasn't seeking fame or notoriety. He was seeking validation, the fundamental human need to have his suffering acknowledged and his struggle recognized as legitimate rather than dismissed as personal failure or moral weakness. "Your pain is real," Elena said, allowing her own emotion to color her voice. "The way you've been treated is genuinely wrong. The system that promised to help you and then pulled that help away at the last second failed you in a way that goes beyond bureaucratic incompetence. It was cruel." Through her earpiece, Elena heard one of the hostages speak for the first time, a woman's voice, shaky but determined, addressing Thomas directly. "Sir, I want you to know that I've been listening to your conversation with Elena, and I believe what you're saying about how you've been treated. I work in loan modifications, and I've seen how the process can give people false hope, and then destroy it through technicalities that aren't explained until it's too late." Elena felt a surge of hope. The hostage was spontaneously providing the kind of human validation that Thomas needed, acknowledging his experience from the perspective of someone who worked within the system he was fighting against. This represented a breakthrough moment where genuine connection was emerging from the crisis. "What's your name?" Thomas asked the woman, his voice gentler than it had been since the standoff began. Jennifer Walsh. I've been with First National for 8 years, mostly helping people navigate loan modifications when they're facing foreclosure. And I have to tell you, what happened to you yesterday happens more often than it should. The computer systems don't communicate properly between departments, and approvals get reversed by automated processes that don't account for individual circumstances. Elena realized that Jennifer Walsh was providing something that no federal negotiator could offer: insider confirmation that Thomas's grievances were based on real systemic problems rather than personal paranoia or misunderstanding. The validation was coming from someone who had no motivation to lie or manipulate, someone whose own life was currently at risk because of Thomas's actions. Jennifer, Elena interjected gently, can you help Thomas understand what options might be available to resolve his loan situation, if we can find a way to end this crisis peacefully? Actually, yes, Jennifer replied, and Elena could hear papers rustling as she apparently consulted documents that had been in the conference room when the crisis began. Thomas, I've got access to the bank's internal systems on my laptop here, and I can see your file. The denial you received this morning was generated by an automated compliance check that flagged a discrepancy in your income verification. But that discrepancy appears to be an error in data entry, not an actual problem with your application. Thomas's breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more regular. Elena recognized the physiological shift that occurred when people moved from fight or flight panic toward cognitive processing of new information. You're saying the denial was wrong? Thomas asked. I'm saying the denial was based on incorrect information, Jennifer clarified. If we can correct the data entry error, your original approval should be reinstated. The modification you thought you had lost yesterday is probably still viable. Elena felt the psychological dynamics of the crisis shifting in real time. Thomas's motivation for violence had been rooted in the belief that he had exhausted all legitimate options and that dramatic action was his only remaining method for gaining attention to his situation. Jennifer's revelation that his legitimate option might still exist was creating cognitive dissonance that could either diffuse his desperation or increase his anger at having been driven to extremes unnecessarily. Thomas, Elena said carefully, how does it feel to hear that there might be a way to solve your loan problem without anyone getting hurt? It makes me want to scream, Thomas replied, and Elena could hear tears in his voice. Do you realize that I came within minutes of killing myself and 7 innocent people because of a data entry error? Do you understand how close we all came to dying because someone in a cubicle somewhere typed the wrong number into a computer? Elena recognized that Thomas was experiencing the psychological whiplash that occurred when people discovered that their desperate actions might have been unnecessary. The rage and despair that had driven him to violence were now competing with relief and hope, creating emotional instability that required careful management. That anger is completely justified, Elena said. You have every right to be furious about how close this came to tragedy because of systematic incompetence. But right now, we have an opportunity to make sure that no one else has to go through what you've experienced. We can use this crisis to highlight exactly how dangerous these bureaucratic failures can be. The federal agents are never going to let me walk out of here, Thomas said, reality beginning to penetrate the emotional intensity of the moment. Even if Jennifer can fix my loan problem, I've still taken hostages and threatened to blow up a building. I've crossed lines that don't get uncrossed. Elena knew that Thomas was correct about the legal consequences he would face. Federal prosecutors would pursue domestic terrorism charges regardless of his motivations or the peaceful resolution of the crisis. He would spend years in prison even if no one was injured. But she also knew that his willingness to accept those consequences could be the key to ending the standoff without violence. You're right that there will be consequences, Elena agreed. But there's a difference between facing legal Consequences as someone who chose to end this peacefully, and facing them as someone who let it escalate to violence. The first option preserves your humanity and your ability to continue fighting for the changes you want to see. The second option makes you a cautionary tale instead of a catalyst for reform. Through her radio, Alina heard new voices, federal agents apparently deciding to communicate directly with Thomas rather than trying to cut off her unauthorized negotiation. Agent Williams's voice came through clearly, addressing Thomas with professional calm. "Mr. Garrett, this is Agent Williams with the FBI. I've been listening to your conversations with Elena and Miss Walsh, and I want you to know that we're prepared to work with you on a peaceful resolution. We understand that you've been driven to this action by legitimate grievances, and we're willing to discuss options that address your concerns while ensuring everyone's safety." Elena held her breath, recognizing that the federal negotiator was taking a significant risk by acknowledging the legitimacy of Thomas's grievances. FBI protocols typically avoided validating terrorist motivations, but Williams was apparently making a strategic decision to prioritize peaceful resolution over procedural purity. "What kind of options?" Thomas asked suspiciously. "We can guarantee that your story will be documented and investigated," Williams replied. "We can ensure that the loan modification issues you've experienced become part of a formal review of banking practices. We can arrange for you to speak with media representatives about systematic problems in financial services, though that would need to happen after you surrender peacefully." Elena realized that Williams was offering Thomas many of the same things she had promised, but with the authority and resources to actually deliver them. The federal agent was essentially adopting Elena's approach, while adding official legitimacy to the commitments being made. "And what about the people in this room?" Thomas asked. "What guarantee do I have that they won't be hurt when I give up the detonator?" "You have my personal guarantee," Williams said without hesitation. "If you release the hostages and surrender your weapon, you will be taken into custody safely and without excessive force. You will have access to legal representation immediately, and your story will be heard by people who have the power to make systemic changes." Elena could hear Thomas's internal struggle through the quality of his breathing and the long pauses between his responses. He was processing the gap between his expectations of how this crisis would end and the actual options being presented to him. The cognitive dissonance was massive. He had prepared himself for death or permanent imprisonment, but now faced the possibility of surviving with his dignity intact and his message heard. "Elena," Thomas said finally, "you started this conversation by saying you couldn't stand the thought that I might think no one understands why I'm doing this. Do you still feel that way? Do you understand?" "I understand that you're not a terrorist," Elena replied without hesitation. "I understand that you're a human being who was pushed beyond his breaking point by a system that treated you as disposable. I understand that you chose this action because you felt invisible and powerless, and this was the only way you could think of to make yourself seen and heard. And I understand that choosing to end this peacefully takes more courage than choosing to end it violently." The silence that followed lasted 37 seconds. Elena counted each one, knowing that Thomas was making the most important decision of his life, while 7 innocent people waited to discover whether they would survive to see their families again. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible burden for months and was finally ready to set it down. "Jennifer, can you really fix my loan modification?" "I can fix the data entry error that caused your denial," Jennifer replied immediately. "I can't guarantee that there won't be other problems down the road, but I can restore your application to approved status and make sure the modification goes through as originally planned." "Agent Williams, if I surrender peacefully, will you really make sure that what happened here becomes part of a larger investigation into how people get driven to desperate actions?" "You have my word," Williams replied. "Your case will become part of a comprehensive review of how financial institutions handle distressed borrowers, And your experience will be documented as evidence of systematic problems that need to be addressed. Thomas was quiet for another 15 seconds. Then Elena heard the sound of something metallic being set down on a hard surface, the distinctive click of a detonator being disarmed and placed on a conference table. "I'm putting down the trigger," Thomas announced. "I'm going to tell the hostages to move away from me, and then I'm going to surrender. Elena, thank you for treating me like a human being. Jennifer, thank you for showing me that there are people in the system who actually care about helping instead of just following procedures. Agent Williams, I hope you keep your promises." Elena felt her knees go weak with relief as she heard movement in the background, hostages carefully moving away from Thomas's position, the sound of a door being opened, and federal agents beginning their careful approach to take Thomas into custody. The critical moment had passed. 7 lives had been saved. The crisis was ending not in violence and tragedy, but in human connection and the possibility of meaningful change. Elena realized that she was crying as she listened to the final moments of a negotiation that had begun with her unauthorized voice on an emergency frequency and ended with the preservation of human life and dignity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. The tactical teams moved with surgical precision through the 34th floor corridors. Elena listened through her hijacked radio frequency as federal agents coordinated Thomas Garrett's surrender, their voices carrying the controlled relief of professionals who had prepared for the worst and received an unexpected gift of peaceful resolution. "Subject is cooperative and stationary," came the first report. "Hands visible, no movement toward any secondary devices. Hostages are clear and moving toward the stairwell under escort." Elena remained in the maintenance shed, her hands trembling slightly as adrenaline began to recede and the magnitude of what had just occurred started to register in her nervous system. She had prevented a mass casualty event by violating every protocol in federal crisis response, hijacking official communications, and conducting unauthorized negotiations with a domestic terrorist. The legal and professional consequences would be severe, but 7 people were walking out of that conference room alive because she had chosen to act rather than comply. Her radio crackled with a new transmission, Agent Williams addressing her directly for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Elena Martinez, this is Agent Patricia Williams with the FBI. I need you to identify your location so we can bring you in for debriefing. Your intervention was unauthorized, but it was also effective. We need to discuss what happened here and how you were able to establish rapport with Mr. Garrett when our standard approaches failed." Elena hesitated before responding. Once she revealed her location, she would be taken into federal custody and subjected to intensive questioning about her actions, her methods, and her background. Her life as a quiet corporate counselor who helped employees navigate workplace stress would be over. She would become a case study in crisis intervention, a person whose methods would be analyzed and either adopted or condemned by law enforcement agencies across the country. But she also recognized that her anonymity was already compromised. Federal agents would trace her signal, identify her through building security records, and locate her regardless of whether she cooperated voluntarily. Her choice was between surrendering with dignity or being apprehended as a fugitive. "Agent Williams, this is Elena Martinez. I'm in the maintenance shed adjacent to the building's service entrance. I'm unarmed and prepared to surrender for debriefing." Within minutes, Elena found herself surrounded by federal agents who approached her with a mixture of professional caution and genuine curiosity. They secured her makeshift communication setup, documented her technical modifications to the building's emergency systems, and escorted her toward the command post with the careful respect accorded to someone whose actions had defied easy categorization. Deputy Director Sarah Chun was waiting when Elena arrived at the federal command post. Chun's expression combined exhaustion from managing a 12-hour crisis with the sharp intelligence of someone trying to understand How a civilian employee assistance counselor had accomplished what trained FBI negotiators could not. Ms. Martinez, Chun began, I need to understand exactly how you gained access to our communication network and why you felt authorized to interfere with an active federal operation. Your actions could have compromised the safety of hostages and federal agents. Elena met Chun's gaze directly, recognizing that this conversation would determine not only her legal fate, but also whether her methods would be dismissed as dangerous amateur interference or acknowledged as effective crisis intervention. I gained access through backup communication lines that I learned to operate during my volunteer work with the Chicago Police Department Crisis Unit, Elena replied calmly. I interfered because I had established prior rapport with Mr. Garrett and understood his psychological profile in ways that your negotiators couldn't. I felt authorized by the principle that saving lives takes precedence over following procedures. Chun studied Elena's personnel file on a tablet, scrolling through educational credentials, employment history, and volunteer service records. It says here that you have a doctorate in clinical psychology and 5 years of experience with police crisis intervention. Why wasn't this information included in your statement to our agents during the initial evacuation? Because I assumed that federal protocols wouldn't accommodate input from civilians regardless of their qualifications, Elena answered honestly. I was correct about that assumption. Your agents dismissed my offer to provide background information about Mr. Garrett's psychological state and motivation. Agent Williams joined the conversation, carrying a folder of preliminary reports from the hostage debriefing. Ms. Martinez, I need you to explain how you knew to approach Mr. Garrett differently than our standard negotiation protocols. Your communication style was completely outside conventional crisis intervention methodology. Elena recognized that Williams was asking her to justify methods that had worked, but couldn't be easily explained through established psychological theory. Mr. Garrett had lost faith in institutional authority because every official system had failed him. He needed to be approached as a human being rather than a case study, and he needed validation of his experience rather than manipulation of his emotions. But how did you know that? Chun pressed. Our psychological profiler suggested that he was resistant to empathy-based approaches because of paranoid tendencies and antisocial ideation. Your assessment was completely different. Because I had spent an hour with him yesterday, Elena explained. I saw him as a desperate man seeking legitimate help rather than a potential terrorist planning violence. I understood that his escalation to violence was driven by systematic failures, not personal pathology. He needed someone to acknowledge that his anger was justified, even if his methods were wrong. Williams made notes while listening to Elena's explanation. The hostages confirmed that you had prior contact with Mr. Garrett. Jennifer Walsh specifically mentioned that you had helped him navigate the loan modification process yesterday afternoon. Can you describe that interaction? Elena provided a detailed account of her encounter with Thomas in the building lobby, his documentation of financial hardship, his frustration with bureaucratic processes, and her successful effort to connect him with a bank representative. She emphasized that Thomas had appeared hopeful when he left the building, believing that his financial crisis was moving toward resolution. So his escalation to violence occurred after he believed his problems were solved? Chun asked. His escalation occurred after the hope I helped him find was destroyed by a data entry error that reversed his loan modification approval, Elena clarified. He wasn't a terrorist who planned an attack. He was a desperate man who was pushed over the edge by systematic incompetence that occurred after he thought he was safe. The federal agents exchanged glances that Elena interpreted as recognition that their initial threat assessment had been fundamentally flawed. They had responded to Thomas as an ideologically motivated domestic terrorist when he was actually a victim of economic desperation who had been driven to extremes by bureaucratic failure. Ms. Martinez, Chun said carefully, you're unauthorized. Intervention violated multiple federal statutes related to interference with law enforcement operations. Under normal circumstances, we would be preparing criminal charges. However, your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life, and your methods appear to have been more effective than our standard protocols. Elena understood that she was being offered a deal cooperation in exchange for reduced legal consequences. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? We want you to consult on our crisis negotiation protocols, Williams interjected. Help us understand why conventional approaches failed with Mr. Garrett, and how we can integrate your methods into our standard procedures. We need to learn from what happened here. Elena felt the irony of the situation settling over her like a blanket. She had violated federal law to prevent a tragedy, and now the federal government wanted to hire her to teach them how to violate their own protocols more effectively. I'm willing to cooperate, Elena said, but I need you to understand that my methods can't be easily systematized. What worked with Thomas Garrett worked because of our specific prior relationship and the unique circumstances of his situation. You can't train agents to replicate genuine human connection through procedural modifications. Chun nodded slowly. We're not asking you to create a manual. We're asking you to help us understand when standard protocols might not be appropriate, and how agents can recognize situations that require unconventional approaches. Agent Williams added, we're also interested in your assessment of systemic issues that might drive ordinary citizens toward extreme actions. Mr. Garrett's case suggests that we need to understand the intersection between economic desperation and domestic terrorism risk. Elena realized that the federal agents were offering her an opportunity to address exactly the issues that had motivated her unauthorized intervention. They wanted her to help them understand not just how to negotiate with people like Thomas Garrett, but how to identify and address the conditions that created people like Thomas Garrett in the first place. I'll consult with you on the condition that any protocols we develop include provisions for preventing crises rather than just responding to them, Elena stipulated. Thomas Garrett didn't need to become a terrorist. He needed competent assistance with his loan modifications 6 months ago. Over the next several hours, Elena found herself at the center of an intensive debriefing process that involved federal agents, crisis negotiation specialists, behavioral analysts, and legal representatives. They wanted to understand every detail of her intervention, her technical methods for accessing communication systems, her psychological approach to establishing rapport with Thomas, her assessment of his mental state and motivation, and her recommendations for preventing similar crises in the future. Revelation that emerged from these discussions was that federal crisis response protocols had been designed primarily for ideologically motivated terrorists and criminal hostage takers, not for economically desperate individuals who had been driven to extremes by systematic failures. Thomas Garrett represented a growing category of domestic threats that existing procedures were ill-equipped to address. We're seeing more cases like this, Chun admitted during one of the debriefing sessions. People with legitimate grievances, who escalate to violence when official channels fail them. Our standard approaches assume that subjects are either mentally ill or ideologically committed to violence, but subjects like Mr. Garrett are neither. They're ordinary people who have been pushed beyond their breaking point. Elena recognized the broader implications of Chun's admission. You're describing a category of domestic terrorism that's created by institutional failures rather than prevented by institutional responses. These aren't people who can be deterred by law enforcement. They're people who need to be helped before they reach the point of desperation. Williams looked up from her notes. Are you suggesting that crisis prevention should be part of domestic security strategy? I'm suggesting that you can't arrest your way out of problems created by economic inequality and bureaucratic incompetence, Elena replied. Thomas Garrett became a terrorist because every legitimate system failed him. If you want to prevent future Thomas Garretts, You need to fix the systems that create them. As the debriefing continued, Elena found herself articulating ideas that she had never fully formed before her unauthorized intervention. Her experience talking Thomas through his surrender had crystallized her understanding of the relationship between individual desperation and systemic violence, between personal crisis and public safety, between human connection and political change. The federal agents were taking notes that would become the foundation for new protocols, training programs, and policy recommendations. Elena's violation of federal law was being transformed into federal policy, her unauthorized intervention becoming the basis for authorized procedures. But the most significant revelation was personal rather than professional. Elena realized that she had discovered her true calling not in the quiet counseling sessions of corporate employee assistants, but in the high-stakes moment when she had chosen to risk everything to save lives through genuine, human connection. When Deputy Director Chun finally asked her whether she would consider joining the FBI as a crisis intervention specialist, Elena's answer came without hesitation. Only if I can work on preventing crises instead of just responding to them. Only if I can help you understand that the best negotiation is the one that never needs to happen because people got help before they reached the breaking point. Chun smiled for the first time since Elena had met her. Ms. Martinez, I think we can arrange that. 6 months after the Meridian Tower crisis, Elena Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the National Crisis Intervention Conference in Washington, D.C. The audience included FBI agents, police crisis negotiators, social workers, psychologists, and policymakers from across the country, professionals who had come to hear about the unauthorized intervention that had redefined their understanding of domestic terrorism and crisis resolution. But Elena wasn't thinking about her audience as she approached the podium. She was thinking about Thomas Garrett, who was serving a reduced sentence at a federal minimum security facility, where he had become a peer counselor helping other inmates navigate the bureaucratic systems that had once defeated him. She was thinking about Jennifer Walsh, who had used her experience as a hostage to champion banking industry reforms that had prevented dozens of foreclosures through improved modification procedures. She was thinking about the 7 people who had walked out of that conference room alive and returned to families who had feared they might never see them again. 6 months ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium, I committed multiple federal crimes to save 7 lives. I hijacked emergency communications, interfered with a federal operation, and conducted unauthorized negotiations with a domestic terrorist. By every measure of law and procedure, my actions were wrong. By every measure of human outcome, they were necessary. The statement created a ripple of tension through the audience. Elena had deliberately chosen to begin with the paradox that defined her story, the gap between following rules and saving lives, between institutional protocol and human connection, between doing what was legal and doing what was right. The traditional narrative of crisis intervention focuses on techniques, protocols, and professional boundaries, Elena continued. We train negotiators to maintain emotional distance, follow established procedures, and operate within clearly defined roles. These approaches work effectively in many situations, but they failed completely with Thomas Garrett, not because they were implemented incorrectly, but because Thomas represented a category of crisis that our existing frameworks hadn't anticipated. Elena paused, allowing the audience to process her implicit challenge to conventional wisdom. She had spent months developing her understanding of what had occurred during those critical hours, and her conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about professional crisis response. Thomas Garrett wasn't a terrorist in the traditional sense. He wasn't motivated by ideology or criminal intent. He wasn't mentally ill or socially disconnected. He was an ordinary person who had been systematically failed by every institution designed to help him, until violence seemed like his only remaining option for making his voice heard by people with the power to address his situation. Dr. Michael Harrison, the conference's keynote speaker and author of the standard textbook on crisis negotiation, raised his hand from the front row. Ms. Martinez, are you suggesting that we should validate the grievances of individuals who take hostages and threaten mass casualties? Doesn't that create incentives for others to use similar tactics? Elena had anticipated this question and had prepared her response carefully. Dr. Harrison, I'm suggesting that we need to distinguish between validating someone's pain and endorsing their actions. Thomas Garrett's financial desperation was real and legitimate. His choice to address that desperation through violence was wrong and inexcusable. But understanding the difference between those two things was essential to reaching him. She clicked to her first slide, which displayed statistics that had been compiled by federal agencies in the months following the Meridian Tower incident. Since January, domestic terrorism incidents involving economically motivated individuals have increased by 43%. These aren't ideological extremists or career criminals. These are people who have exhausted legitimate channels and concluded that dramatic action is necessary to gain attention for their circumstances. The statistics created a murmur of concern throughout the auditorium. Elena's assertion that Thomas Garrett represented a growing trend rather than an isolated incident had implications that extended far beyond crisis negotiation into domestic security policy and economic justice. The federal response to this trend has been to enhance tactical capabilities and refine negotiation procedures, Elena continued. But tactical solutions can't address problems created by systematic institutional failures. You can't arrest your way out of an economic crisis that's pushing ordinary people toward desperate actions. Agent Patricia Williams, who was seated in the middle section of the auditorium, stood to address Elena's assertion. Ms. Martinez, while I agree that prevention is preferable to response, law enforcement agencies can't be responsible for solving economic inequality or reforming bureaucratic systems. Our job is to protect public safety when those systems fail. Elena nodded respectfully. Agent Williams, you're absolutely correct that law enforcement can't solve systemic economic problems. But law enforcement can recognize when those problems are creating security threats and can adjust their response strategies accordingly. The techniques that work with ideologically motivated terrorists don't work with economically desperate individuals, because their psychological profiles and motivations are completely different. She advanced to her next slide, which outlined the new crisis intervention protocols that had emerged from her consultation with federal agencies. The FBI has developed what they're calling economic desperation protocols for situations involving subjects whose actions appear to be motivated by financial crisis rather than criminal or ideological intent. These protocols emphasize validation of legitimate grievances while maintaining clear boundaries about acceptable behavior. The protocols represented a fundamental shift in federal crisis response, acknowledging that some domestic terrorism incidents required social work skills rather than tactical expertise. Elena had spent months training federal agents to recognize the difference between criminal hostage-taking and desperation-driven crisis behavior, helping them understand when empathy might be more effective than authority. But the most important lesson from the Meridian Tower crisis isn't about law enforcement tactics, Elena said, advancing to a slide that displayed photographs of Thomas Garrett before and after his financial crisis began. The most important lesson is about how quickly ordinary people can be pushed beyond their breaking point when the systems designed to help them fail systematically. The photograph showed a stark transformation. The first image depicted Thomas in his construction supervisor uniform, smiling at a job site with his crew visible in the background. The second showed him during his court appearance following the crisis, haggard, defeated, but somehow more peaceful than he had appeared in months before his arrest. Thomas Garrett didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a terrorist. Elena explained. He became a terrorist gradually, through a series of bureaucratic failures that destroyed his faith in legitimate solutions to legitimate problems. His loan modification was approved and then denied due to a data entry error. His unemployment benefits expired due to processing delays. His requests for legal assistance were dismissed due to income requirements. Each individual failure was minor. Their cumulative impact was catastrophic. Dr. Harrison raised his hand again. Are you suggesting that we should excuse violence based on bureaucratic incompetence? I'm suggesting that we should prevent violence by eliminating bureaucratic incompetence, Elena replied firmly. Thomas Garrett's case has been used to identify and correct systematic problems in loan modification procedures that have prevented similar crises for hundreds of other families. Jennifer Walsh, who was one of his hostages, has become a leading advocate for banking industry reforms that address the institutional failures that created Thomas's desperation. Elena's next slide displayed testimonials from other individuals who had received assistance through programs developed in response to the Meridian Tower crisis. Emergency financial counseling services had been established in major cities. Banks had implemented early warning systems to identify customers at risk of foreclosure-related desperation. Social service agencies had developed rapid response protocols for individuals facing economic crisis. The real victory of the Meridian Tower incident isn't that 7 lives were saved, Elena said, her voice gaining strength as she approached her conclusion. The real victory is that the systematic failures that created Thomas Garrett's desperation have been identified and addressed, preventing similar crises for countless other families. She paused, looking out over an audience that had been transformed from skeptical professionals into engaged advocates for systematic change. But the most profound lesson from that day has nothing to do with protocols or procedures. It has to do with the power of genuine human connection to bridge seemingly impossible divides. Elena's final slide displayed a simple message: listen first, judge never, connect always. Thomas Garrett surrendered peacefully, not because I followed negotiation protocols, but because I treated him as a human being whose pain was real, even though his methods were wrong. I didn't try to manipulate his emotions or exploit his vulnerabilities. I simply acknowledged his experience and offered him a pathway toward hope that preserved his dignity while protecting innocent lives. The auditorium had fallen completely silent. Elena could see tears in the eyes of several audience members, recognition dawning on faces throughout the crowd. In our professional roles, we often forget that behind every crisis is a person who is suffering in ways that they don't know how to express appropriately. Behind every desperate action is someone who has exhausted their faith in legitimate solutions. Behind every extreme behavior is a human being who needs to be seen, heard, and understood. Elena stepped back from the podium, but her voice carried clearly across the auditorium without amplification. The next time you encounter someone whose actions seem incomprehensible, ask yourself, what pain are they trying to communicate? What hope are they trying to preserve? What dignity are they fighting to maintain? The answers to those questions will guide you toward connection rather than confrontation, toward understanding rather than judgment, toward solutions rather than force. As applause began to build throughout the auditorium, Elena thought once more about Thomas Garrett, who had written to her the previous week to thank her for helping him find a way to tell his story that created change rather than tragedy. She thought about the counselors, negotiators, and social workers who would return to their communities with a new understanding of how to reach people in crisis. She thought about the policymakers who would carry her message into bureaucratic systems that desperately needed reform. But mostly, she thought about the truth that had guided her through that terrifying day in the maintenance shed, that every human being deserves to be heard, understood, and treated with dignity, especially when they're at their most desperate. and least deserving of compassion. Sometimes the most important leadership happens in the shadows, performed by people who choose connection over protocol, understanding over authority, and humanity over procedure. Sometimes the most crucial intervention comes not from those with official permission to act, but from those who recognize that some situations require us to risk everything for the simple principle that every life has value and every voice deserves to be heard. Elena Martinez had proven that day that the power to save lives doesn't come from badges or protocols or institutional authority. It comes from the courage to see another person's pain clearly, the wisdom to respond with genuine compassion, and the determination to treat every human being as worthy of dignity, hope, and connection. In a world that often feels divided by fear, politics, and institutional failure, Elena's story reminds us that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to control others, but in our capacity to understand them. Not in our power to enforce compliance, but in our willingness to create genuine connection across even the most impossible circumstances. The quiet heroes among us aren't always the ones who follow the rules. Sometimes they're the ones who have the courage to break them when human lives hang in the balance, and when doing the right thing matters more than doing the legal thing. Elena Martinez saved 7 lives that day, not because she was trained to negotiate with terrorists, but because she was brave enough to treat a desperate man as a human being worthy of understanding. Her unauthorized voice on that emergency frequency proved that leadership isn't about authority, it's about the willingness to step forward when others step back, to speak when others stay silent, and to choose connection when others choose control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.